very pleased that in the end this procedure ended in the adoption of this minimum wage directive. And once again, as president of the workers group, I'm really pleased that we have this high-level debate today. I look forward to all the contributions, and especially I'm very delighted now to hand over to our moderator today, János Allenbach-Amann. Please, János.
Thank you very much, Oliver Röpke, and for the introduction, and congratulations on your designation as the future EESC president. As Oliver said, I am János Allenbach-Amann. I am economy editor at Directive and author of the Economy Brief newsletter. And it is my great pleasure and also honor to guide us through the rest of the day to discuss the EU directive on adequate minimum wages. As you know, the directive is expected to get its final formal stamp of approval next week on Tuesday. And then member states will have 2 years to transpose the directive into national law. While in the afternoon we will talk about exactly this transposition and how member states will introduce this directive at home. In the morning we will first talk about the directive itself and about the way that it came about. For this we have an illustrious panel with us today that I would like to quickly introduce. We have Cinzia Del Rio, EESC rapporteur on the file, here with us. Then Oliver Röpke, of course, that I do not need to further introduce, I think. And we will have Esther Lynch with us here. She is on her way. She's Deputy General Secretary of the European Trade Union Confederation. And joining us online is the member of the European Parliament, Agnes Jongerius, who was one of the 2 co-rapporteurs of the directive in the Parliament. I'm looking forward to hear all of your perspectives on the directive. However, to set the stage for the discussion, we will first hear 2 input speeches, and I think we have the ideal guests for this. First, representing the Czech presidency of the EU Council, we will hear from Czech Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Labour and Social Affairs, Marian Jurečka. After this, we will hear from Nathalie Darnaud, head of the unit Labour Market and Wages and Eurofound at the Directorate General for Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion at the EU Commission. Welcome, Minister Jurečka, and welcome, Ms. Darnaud. Thank you for joining us. Before giving you the floor, I would like to give some information on the people, for the people who join us online via the social media live stream. If you want, you can send us your questions by commenting below the video, and we will try to feed it into our discussions afterwards in the Q&A. We will afterwards also have a short moderated discussion, and then we will take questions from the workers group, but also from online. So now, without further ado, I would like to give you the floor, Minister Jurečka, for your keynote speech.
Děkuji, dobré dopoledne.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to greet you all very warmly at this meeting. On behalf of the Czech Parliament. I'm afraid that's where I am because I have to be there, but I'm very glad indeed that your meeting is focusing on the question of minimum wages and good working conditions for people working in the member states. I very much welcome this shift that has been taking place in recent months, and I'd like to thank everyone who has played an active part in this, seeking to lay down the right principles for the minimum wage and collective bargaining. I particularly appreciate the fact that ultimately a compromise was agreed agreeing that provision will be made for certain differences in economic and other conditions in the member states, rather than going for a universal solution. But we need to focus on the principles that we have. The setting of a minimum wage needs to take account of those. The interpreter apologizes, the sound really isn't good, but we are doing our best. And I think on behalf of the Czech Republic, it's a great opportunity for us to ensure that transparent conditions are laid down, not just for workers, but for employers. And in the collective bargaining processes that take place within our tripartite system, I've always seen a debate between representatives of the unions and the employers. And sometimes those debates have been rather more emotional than rational and so that is why I'm very pleased that we have this proposal for a directive which lays down a rather more rational basis for ensuring minimum wages are set in the right way for our member states, so that we can have something which is clear and predictable for both workers and employers. And I'll be very glad if we are all able to increase the awareness of the need for collective bargaining agreements, which are a tradition in member states and which are applied across the board. We need to increase society's awareness of this, because unfortunately we are seeing that people are becoming less active, less involved and committed within trade union organizations. And so there's a lack of awareness in society. People need to take a greater interest in their rights and their conditions. And I think it's very important that we can communicate this better, so that people will then try all the more to play an active role in these processes. And I think the social dialogue is really very important, and it lays down the foundation for social cohesion, which needs to afford a long-term perspective and to ensure the economic and social development of our our common economic European Union. So I'd like to thank you for today's meeting, but also for all the stakeholders who are playing a part in helping to take this forward. So that's all I would like to say, and my warmest greetings on behalf of from the Czech Republic, and thank you very much indeed for your attention.
Thank you very much, Minister Jurečka, for your words and for taking your time to speak to us today. I understand that you have a very tight time schedule. An EU Council presidency comes with quite a busy schedule, I assume. So we won't keep you any longer than necessary. Thank you very much again. Now we will turn to Nathalie Darnaud, who will also take around 5 to 10 minutes to give us some more insights into the main elements of the directive. Madame Darnaud, the floor is yours.
Madame Darnaud, can you please press button raise hand and then press button speak? Thank you.
So does it work now?
Yes, it's working.
Okay, very good. So many thanks, and good morning to all. I'm very happy to take part in today's event on the directive for adequate minimum wages in the European Union. It's a very timely moment to start discussing the transposition and implementation of the directive, as the legislative process is about to come to an end. I mean, it was already mentioned that the Council is expected to formally adopt the provisional agreement next Tuesday, following its endorsement by the European Parliament on the 14th of September. As was highlighted by Commissioner Schmid at the EP plenary, the directive is a historic achievement for social Europe and also a crucial step towards the implementation of the European Pillar of Social Rights. It's also a very relevant initiative at the current juncture when the high inflation and its impact on the purchasing power of low-income households is a major cause of concern. So the negative consequences of the higher cost of living are already visible, with the share of low-income households estimated to have increased to close to 70. I mean, those hit by energy poverty estimated to have increased to close to 70% in June this year. And this situation is also expected to lead to an increase in in-work poverty, which already affected almost 1 out of 10 workers in the EU in 2021. So ensuring that work pays and allows for a decent living is a commitment taken by President von der Leyen at the start of her mandate, when she announced that she would present a legal instrument to ensure that workers in the EU are protected by adequate minimum wages. And on the 28th of October 2020, the Commission delivered on this commitment with the adoption of its proposed directive. So now we are very close to making this a concrete reality for EU workers. As was already mentioned, member states will have 2 years to transpose the directive. So this looks like a lengthy period in the current context of high energy and food prices. This is why Commissioner Schmid has called on member states to ensure a swift transposition and implementation of the directive so that EU workers can soon enjoy its benefits. In my presentation, I will briefly take you through the main provisions of the directive, focusing in particular on those related to collective bargaining and the role of social partners. And then I will say a few words on the support the Commission will provide during the transposition phase. So let me start by some remarks on the purpose and the main provisions of the directive. The directive establishes an EU framework for promoting, for setting adequate statutory minimum wages, promoting collective bargaining on wages, and enhancing the effective access of workers to minimum wage protection. It fully respects national competencies, the autonomy of social partners, and the specificities of national systems. In particular, it does not call into question systems of wage formation based on collective bargaining. If anything, it will reinforce them, as the directive aims at strengthening collective bargaining, which is considered a key element to achieve adequate minimum wage protection. The directive provides for a combination of measures, with some applying to only countries with statutory minimum wages and others applying to all member states. So more specifically, all member states are requested to first promote collective bargaining on wages. I will come back to this in a moment. And second, enhance the enforcement and monitoring of minimum wage protection. In addition, countries with statutory minimum wages have to put in place a clear governance framework, which should include elements such as clear criteria for setting and updating statutory minimum wages, indicative reference values to assess their adequacy, and regularly and timely updates. So this is a very brief overview of the content of the directive. Now I would like to focus on the provisions related to the promotion of collective bargaining and more generally the role of social partners. The promotion of collective bargaining on wage setting is a cornerstone of the directive. This reflects the fact that well-functioning collective bargaining, together with the high coverage, is an important means to strengthen the adequacy and the coverage of minimum wages. And this holds for all member states, regardless of their minimum wage setting system. So coming back to the provision on collective bargaining, the requirements for all member states are twofold. As a first element, they are required to take measures to facilitate the exercise of the right to collective bargaining on wages and to increase the collective bargaining coverage. As a second element, member states with a collective bargaining coverage below 80% have to take or will have to take additional measures, namely to provide for a framework of enabling conditions on collective bargaining and to establish an action plan to promote collective bargaining to be regularly reviewed and, if needed, updated. As regards the role of social partners, the directive requires member states to effectively and timely involve them in the setting and updating of statutory minimum wages. In addition, in several provisions, the directive calls for the protection of the rights of social partners in order to allow them to collectively bargain on wages. And finally, as is common practice for directives in the social field, member states can entrust social partners with the implementation of the directive in full or in part. So let me now briefly explain how the Commission will support member states in the transposition process. So as already mentioned, member states will have 2 years to transpose the directive into their national legislation. In order to support them, the Commission will set up an expert group, as is usually the practice. The membership of the group still has to be decided. It will be composed of representatives of member states, as member states are responsible for the correct transposition of the directive. At the same time, the Commission will also ensure that social partners are duly represented. And certainly the role of social partners will be key, as the directive touches upon issues that are at the core of their activities. The exact mandate and the rules of procedure of the group also remain to be decided. So what we can say at this stage is that the Commission would like the group to start its work early next year, with a view to issuing its final report 1 year before the transposition deadline. So to conclude, the directive on adequate minimum wages in the EU is a big step forward towards ensuring adequate working and living conditions for EU workers, and as well as building fair, resilient and inclusive economies and societies. A swift transposition and implementation of the directive would be important in the current context of high inflation to mitigate the negative impact on the purchasing power of low-wage earners. The Commission will support member states in their efforts to transpose and implement the directive, and I'm certain that today's event will provide many valuable insights in this regard. So I wish you fruitful discussions, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Nathalie Darnaud, for this comprehensive and very informative input. I think we are all now up to speed with the main elements of this directive. So we have a good basis for our discussion. I understand that you, Ms. Darnaud, are not able to join us for our discussions here, so we won't keep you any longer, and thank you again for your input. Now, as we have these first elements, I would like to take a look at how this directive came about. And very much at the beginning of the process, there was an exploratory opinion by the EESC that was published after the Commission had showed its intention that it would maybe take legislative action to regulate minimum wages. And luckily we have the rapporteur of the exploratory opinion here with us. So to start this discussion, Oliver Röpke, What did you focus on in this exploratory opinion 2 years ago, and which of those elements do you still see reflected in today's directive?
Yes, thank you very much, Janos. Maybe allow me to go one step back, because as you rightly pointed out, this exploratory opinion was drafted before the Commission came out with its proposal. So that was a bit a specific situation, because at the same time, of course, the social partners have been consulted on this file, as always, when it comes to an initiative in the field of social policy. And it was at this time that the European Parliament asked us as EESC for an exploratory opinion. And I would like to thank especially one of the panelists, Agnes Jongerius, because she was one of the coordinators in the Employment Committee of the Parliament who asked us for this exploratory opinion. I think it shows that this committee can also contribute with ideas to show the way forward already before the Commission has presented its proposals. So this was actually the aim of our work. And it's true, I was one of the rapporteurs. The second one was the president of the employers group, Stefano Malia, and the president of the study group was the president of group 3. So all the 3 groups were involved in this work. And I think it was a good example to show that this committee could show some possible paths for an initiative of the European Commission. At this time, it was not clear if the Commission will come up with a recommendation or with a legally binding directive. Of course, we as a workers' group, we always pushed for a legally binding initiative. But you asked me about our opinion. Actually, we tried to take into consideration experiences in different member states. So we organized virtual country visits to countries like Sweden, Germany, Poland, Spain, Romania, to learn a bit from their perspective, from their situation, and to see where can or how can a European initiative can give added value to them. So it was not a surprise that the views were quite different in different member states, but also among the social partners. So, but in the end, at least we found some common ground. Because we found some common ground, we said, and all the 3 groups here in the House said, that all workers should benefit from fair and decent wages, which is already important. So there was the clear commitment that also Europe should play a role in this respect, that we cannot leave this question exclusively to member states, especially in times where in some member states we didn't see any progress. On the contrary, we saw decreasing coverage rates of collective bargaining, and even the wage increases often not in line with the increase of productivity standards. So there was some common ground, and I think this was already important. When it came then to the question which kind of initiative the European Commission should take, then we had different views here. Clearly, we had different views, but we expressed our preference clearly for a legally binding initiative as workers' group, and in the end, that was also the position of the vast majority of this committee. If you ask me what we can find in the final proposal of the Commission, then I would say the strong focus on collective bargaining. Here we agreed among the 3 groups, also with the employers, that fostering collective bargaining should be really in the core of this initiative. We said it from the beginning on, and we also said that, and that was important also for our colleagues, that any initiative should fully respect national competences, national traditions, and specific situation in countries regarding their wage setting systems. And then, of course, we showed some possible avenues, and we here highlighted and emphasized that, for example, the use of public procurement should be taken into consideration to integrate stronger than it is at the moment social criteria in existing EU public procurement legislation. That was one demand. Improving data collection among member states, of course. And then we showed possible ways how to implement a recommendation or a directive. That was actually the situation. We didn't take a clear position at this time because there was no proposal on the table. But I think what I've heard from the Parliament and from the Commission, we were actually one of the first institutions who took a position which was in general positive towards a European initiative from the European Commission. So that was the state of play at this time. And we delivered this opinion, we debated it here, we promoted it towards the other institutions, and then of course, but you will come back to this later, then of course we did also our job to advise and to advise the legislators on the final draft, which was then published by the European Commission. But once again, I think it was a good example that there was a certain impact of the European Economic and Social Committee, and we worked very closely with the social partners, and I myself also with Esther Lynch on this file, so I'm very happy that she joined us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, after this exploratory opinion, the Commission did bring forward its concrete proposal, and then it went, of course, into the institutions. And there, in the European Parliament, it was taken up by Agnes Jongerius, whom I'd like to turn to now. You were the co-rapporteur of the European Parliament on this file, and already before involved, as Oliver Röpke just told us. I would like you to take us back a bit to the negotiations that you were part of, first in the Parliament and then also in the trilogues. What were the biggest challenges in these negotiations, and how did you manage to overcome them?
Yes, now it's working. Thank you for the invitation. And can I just use the opportunity to first congratulate Oliver with his re-election, because I think he explained already that he did a great job in this file before, and I'm expecting a lot of great jobs from him later on. So congratulations from my side here from the Netherlands. If I look at the way the negotiations went, some of the issues have already been mentioned. For instance, indeed, that from the start, the president of the European Commission committed to guarantee working people in Europe an adequate income. Of course, this statement of van der Leyen didn't came out of the blue. There has been a long campaign. There has been pressure from the trade union movement. There has been pressure from my political group. But to be fair, I worked on this file with my co-rapporteur, Dennis Radke. And he was also absolutely an ally in bringing the proposal to the table. And perhaps just, I don't know if I can say it like this, but I think the fact that both he and I have a background in the trade union movement helped during the negotiation. And that was necessary because although von der Leyen made the statement, that didn't mean that everything after that fell in place automatically. There are still people who think that the recipe in the previous crisis we sent to, for instance, Greece was the best recipe. So lowering of the minimum wages, lowering of the collective bargaining coverage. There are still, let's say, fans of this recipe book in the European atmosphere, also in the European Parliament. And I think when the directive in the end came to the table, we requested it. We said this was a promise to us by von der Leyen. So come up with this proposal. We wrote an own initiative report on it in preparing the Porto summit, and also mentioned it there and got the support from the parliament. But still, there were people who thought okay, let's consult as many lawyers as we can to make the point that this directive is violating the treaty, that it should be a recommendation or it should not be there at all. And this has been um, happening from the start during the whole process. But in the end, I think if you look at the numbers of the vote in the European Parliament 2 weeks ago, if you look at the broad support, and the broad support also in Council, with 2 member states voting against, but even Viktor Orban didn't dare to vote against it anymore, but just abstained. I think we were able to push, make use of all the allies in the field. And I see here from Utrecht 2 of my close allies, 3 of my close allies at the podium. By keeping our eye on the ball, we were able to put aside all the ideological objections, put aside all those legal arguments, because in the end it is a sound proposal, and it's indeed high time that we learn the lessons from the previous crisis, the previous recipe book. And I think this is, for me, perhaps even the most important signal from this directive and from this vote. Europe is choosing for working people a different direction. We're choosing the direction of higher minimum wages, of more collective bargaining. And with this directive, we tried to help this push at the European level and at the member state level. And therefore, I must say I'm quite grateful, but also for the support I got from your committee. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Agnes Jongerius. I mean, if Viktor Orban didn't put himself in the way of this, maybe the EU should put you on some other files as well. I would now like to turn to Cinzia Del Rio. You were the rapporteur of the EESC on the directive proposal. Could you take us maybe back, as Agnes Jongerius did, from her perspective, from the Parliament, how your work was during this time?
Thanks, Janos. First of all, we had the work on the opinion between 2020 2021, so more than 1 year ago. So we worked on the first draft of the Commission. And we started from the opinion of Oliver has worked on, and with some key messages. Of course, we had a very difficult approach from Group 1, in particular, employers. They never supported the legal instrument, so their approach was against the legal instrument, but not against some key principles. So it is important that they agree on key principles, but they think that it's better to have a different instrument based more on capacity building, moral suasion, discussions, recommendations, and so on. But so the key principles are, first of all, the context. We have a problem of in-work poverty. We have a problem of wage dumping in certain countries. We are in the middle of discussing how a well-functioning internal market should work, and wages is part of this. Labor conditions is part of this. And we have a context of low wages, in particular in some countries where we have statutory minimum wages below the poverty line. This is the context. And we have a lot of data, so no contestable. It's there. Of course, we had different approaches also between countries with statutory minimum wages and countries who have wages setting through collective bargaining. Because the big discussion was, does a legal instrument interfere with the autonomy of social partners in wage setting? So this was part of the discussion, and of course we think that the directive doesn't interfere. First of all, the directive doesn't impose to set a statutory minimum wage in countries where there is no statutory minimum wage. I come from Italy. We stick to our system. We don't want to still change our system of collective bargaining wage setting. But this was a big discussion, so you have to consider this. But we state very clearly that minimum wages, however they are set, should guarantee a decent living. So the adequacy of minimum wage. There is a lot of discussion about the concept of adequacy. We ask for criteria, okay. But it is important that we agreed that minimum wages have to be adequate. That means to guarantee a decent living. Then, of course, depends at national level what we put in, which are the indicators. We asked for binding indicators. So these are some elements which we agreed with the employers. Then, of course, you know maybe the procedure of the of the opinion and the discussion that we had. But we also discussed about the role of the state in setting the so-called enabling conditions. And we enter into some elements of the enabling conditions because there is a role of the state, even in the country where we have wage setting by collective bargaining, there is the role of the state. Because we have, in some countries, labor codes which frame legally how collective bargaining should go, what is the role of representative social partners, what is the instruments that the state can put in place in order to encourage. So there is the role of the state in a certain way. It might be legal or might be a promotional approach. So these are the elements in which we moved. We said very clearly that we need to respect the autonomy of social partners, that in the countries where the system by itself, in the countries where wage setting is set by collective bargaining, the role of the state should not be so prominent because the system by itself can regulate and can guarantee adequate minimum wages. So these differences might be a bit boring, I don't know, but these were very key issues that we raised in our opinion. Then we entered into more difficult, or we can see later on which are the points that we stressed about how to increase collective bargaining on representativeness of social partners. We indicate some criteria. Of course, we cannot set European criteria, but at least we can list some criteria because we have a big problem of yellow unions. We have a big problem of non-representative employers associations. So these are issues which have to be set, that have to be addressed at national level. But the European directive can lead, is going to give some guidance, and then it's in the hands of member states to. So I stop here, then in the discussion we can enter more in, of course, what I can say, we adopted the opinion in April last year, so it was the first draft. Then, of course, we we see how the debate and in the Commission, in the Parliament, in the Council went, the different opinions of governments, but at least it was a first point for us to set some joint and common criteria. Thank you.
So I would like to turn to you, Esther Lynch, now. So we have heard there is a big focus on collective bargaining in this directive, and this is a strong role for the trade unions as well. How do you think the directive can change the position and the role of trade unions in the EU?
So I'm also really happy to be here on this special and very well-deserved day for hopefully for Oliver. The directive answers the question, or at least tries to answer the question, of how do we resolve what's gone wrong with wages in Europe. And what went wrong with wages in Europe? They no longer kept track with productivity, and they no longer were providing an opportunity for workers to get a fair share of the wealth that they were creating. And why was that? Well, a lot of the reason had to do with the actions of the EU in the financial crisis, of reducing minimum wages, and of removing collective bargaining structures, in particular sectoral collective bargaining systems. So with that analysis, it was critically important that what the directive would do is in places where there were statutory minimum wages, that it would seek to ensure that they were adequate, that member states were not seeking to compete with each other on the basis of low statutory minimum wages, that there was a threshold of decency of 50 to 60 of 50% of the average or 60% of the median, and then there was a second check to make sure that that was adequate for the cost of living. That was the main idea. The second and more important idea is an understanding now in law from the EU that the only way you get fair wages is by having collectively bargained wages. And who does that? Trade unions. Very clear now in law. And an obligation on member states to make sure that they have in place an enabling framework that supports trade unions to collectively bargain on wages. Now, what that enabling framework will look like at national level is going to be different. It has by its character, it's absolutely going to have to be different because the problems are different everywhere. And so that's why it's essential, and I'm really, really looking forward to hearing the outcomes of all of the work that you're going to do about the action plans. It's absolutely essential that we facilitate with lots of information about what works in different member states, having a good menu of options available, and not to have at all a one-size-fits-all, other than the one-size-that-fits-all being trade unions do collective bargaining for wages, and that's how you get fair wages, and that is the one-size-that-fits-all. What the details of that are don't need to be one-size-fits-all. The important then parts of that, and I was particularly noticed that Oliver already highlighted, one of the provisions being the interpretation of what public procurement rules mean. And that's critically important to recognise that that already applies now. It doesn't need a 2-year transposition, because the provision that's in the directive is interpreting the existing public procurement law, so it already applies now. Don't need to wait for a 2-year of a transposition. So just to alert everybody to that. So for us, we see there's always a three-point struggle. The first is to win the law at EU level. The second is to win the transposition, which we're now entering into. And then the third is to win the implementation to make sure that we're all fully equipped to make best use of it. So that's where our analysis of why we did it and what was won.
Okay, seems like there's a lot of fighting ahead still for you. Now, we have heard there's a big focus on collective bargaining, but it is also called the minimum wage directive, or the directive for adequate minimum wages. However, the EU cannot really force a member state to increase its minimum wage, of course. But and maybe I would like to hear you, Agnes Jongerius, on this. How exactly do you plan to, or can social partners, can trade unions use this directive to increase their minimum wages? What are the levers that there are for doing this?
Yes, the directive is called adequate minimum wages, and I think it's not called adequate minimum wages for nothing. It is already mentioned before, also by Cynthia, for instance, that in our analyzing, I must say also in my own country, the Netherlands, minimum wages have been kept not up to speed with the average wage level and with productivity levels. And in this directive, no, we cannot describe from the European level the minimum wage in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Lithuania, etc. But what we did is worked on this topic of adequacy and say in this directive it's important. No, it's not important. It's necessary that all member states with statutory minimum wages assess the adequacy of their minimum wages. And in the directive, we point to two different routes. We say you can, on the one hand, work with a so-called basket of goods and services. So can a minimum wage earner in, for instance, Bulgaria, buy all the necessary goods and services, clothes, food on the table? Can you send your kids to school, etc.? So a basket of goods and services. And the other thing, and that has been resisted quite a lot, first in the parliament, later on also in the negotiations in trilogue, we were able to include this so-called international standard, where a minimum wage should be related to the average and the medium income, the so-called KITE index. It's mentioned in the directive as one way of a member state to assess the adequacy of their minimum wage. And of course, I have not seen the latest figures with all the inflation and skyrocketing prices. But the latest figures from the OECD stems from 2020. And then based on this so-called KITES index, this 50-60% index, in 23 of the 27 member states, the minimum wage is inadequate. So it's not meeting up to the standard. And my advice in the transposition would be keep the figures up to date. So ask for update figures on the average and medium income development in a member state. Assess it, and I think we give a perfect instrument to all the trade unions and all the NGOs at member state level to say, why is my country, and the same is true for the Netherlands, why is my country in the list of working with an inadequate minimum wage? There is an obligation to assess and to report to Brussels. There is no obligation to use one of these two instruments. But of course, this will be the next battle in transposition and in fighting for higher minimum wages. And I think the present economic situation shows that it's absolutely necessary that we push for higher minimum wages.
Thank you. I would now like to turn back to Cinzia Del Rio, back to collective bargaining. Are there some specific ways in which collective bargaining could be improved thanks to this directive now?
First, I would like to add one point that we discussed a lot about adequacy. Adequate minimum wages linked to productivity. This was a big discussion because we say in the opinion that we are talking about minimum wages, minimum, which should guarantee a decent living. We are not discussing about the wage policy and the increase of the wage policy, and therefore increase of wages linked to productivity, linked to the sectors, and so on. When we discuss about minimum wage, we should really look at the basket of goods and services, at the reference income, at the living of the person. So the productivity element should not come when we talk about minimum, which is a really substantial way of living. So I wanted just to underline this because it was a long discussion to make this difference between minimum wage setting and wage increases in the dynamics of the wage policy. Now, when we come to collective bargaining, of course, we will see in the implementation of in the transposition, and then in the implementation of the directive, what will come out with the action plans, because this is something that has to be set. We think that there are some measures that could be taken at national level in order to support collective bargaining. First of all, as I said, some criteria about the representativeness of social partners, because we have in some countries a real issue about yellow unions. If I come from the trade union, so we know very, very well what yellow unions are, non-representative. We cannot set criteria at European level, but we say we addressed this issue. For instance, the number of collective agreements signed. This could be a criteria. The affiliation to international organizations could be a criteria. The representation at national and territorial level and sector level, this can be. So there are a number of criteria. Of course, they are different from country to country, but they have to be accompanied by the state in order to push social partners to fix this criteria. Then there are examples that we have at European level in many countries, in a number of countries, of labor codes which provide instruments to facilitate the participation of workers in the trade union activity. For instance, paid leaves to participate to trade union assemblies. This is something, or secondment of the trade union delegates and the state covers part of social contributions. There are these examples. Of course, we cannot have this at European level, but we can work more on this in order to facilitate the participation of workers in the collective bargaining process, and also to strengthen trade unions and social partners in this way. So, and then I would also add strong anti-union busting measures, because we need, in some countries, there are a lot of discrimination measures which are not addressed, And we need to have a strong position by the state with a legal framework to fight against this anti-union busting, which is worrying in some countries. So this is the elements where we have worked and also put on, but we have a lot on this.
Thank you very much. I would now like to open the floor for questions, either here in the room or also via the Interaxio platforms, if you want to go, and also online in social media. You can still, of course, post here. So over there, I don't see your name, but go ahead, please.
Merci. Je vais parler.
Thank you. I'm going to speak French. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for this debate. I think we're now getting to a crucial point in time in Europe. I'm Franca Salis-Madinier. This debate really cuts across the whole of Europe. I'm looking at it from the perspective of what I see in my own country, France, as a trade unionist, whenever I go to France, and what I see in the teams. I'd like to start by making a couple of points. Differences between member states. Well, there are two significant differences between the member states. One is the clear difference in wages. If you have someone in Bulgaria and Denmark, the wages are very different. The costs of remuneration for work, pay, is very different indeed. And so with the underlying issue of dumping, which really does arise specifically in countries where people are better paid, who relocate to countries where wages are lower. And secondly, this is a very important point when it comes to this directive, differences in terms of collective bargaining coverage. There are some countries where only 7% of workers are covered by collective bargaining agreements, and there are other countries, including my own, for example, where the figure is 89 or even 99% of workers covered, because there is legislation which stipulates that if an agreement is concluded, it applies across the board to everyone. So there is one clear point that the directive makes, that is, national collective bargaining systems should not in any way be called into question. Now that's all very fine, but that applies where the systems work. But if the system is weak, if the national collective bargaining system doesn't cover 93% of workers, then how will the directive be able to put the measures in place in order, as I've heard, to negotiate? I've heard that there is the will to do this, but what about penalties or checks and balances? If countries which fail to implement these collective bargaining processes and wage earners are then not covered by them, how will they be penalised? What sort of checks will there be on that? And how can it be ensured that if there are no penalties, the approach will be effective, will actually work?
Is it to somebody specifically, the question?
Yeah, maybe the representative of the parliament and also, of course, our speakers like Esther Lynch. Je pense qu'il y a eu des réflexions à la Confédération européenne.
I think there has been some thinking about this, and I think all three could answer the question.
All right, so I would like to give the floor first to Agnes Jongerius and then to Esther Lynch.
Yes, thanks. And thanks for the question. And yes, indeed, there are differences in the different member states. And if it's on the adequacy of the minimum wage, it's also clear that this basket of goods and services and the so-called kites index, so the relation with the average income, leads to different outcomes. So yes, some people are asking me now, do I get the same minimum wage everywhere, all over Europe? No, that's not the case, and I'm afraid not in my lifetime we will come to the situation where the upwards conversions leads to a minimum wage all over Europe. On this topic of this coverage of the collective bargaining, yes, there is also a big difference between the different member states. And still, we decided that although the proposal of the Commission originally foresaw a coverage percentage ratio of 70%, to raise this level to 80%, just because we are completely convinced that the best way of minimum wage protection for workers all over Europe is the coverage of these workers by a collective agreement. And does the system contains real penalties? No, I'm afraid not. The system foresees in a obligation of the member states who have not reached this level of 80% to sit around the table with their social partners. And of course, social partners are employers, but I do put a lot of hope on the shoulders of the trade unions to make a plan how to come to this level of 80%. And in that sense, not a system with penalties, but a system with clear defined goals and a obligation to sit around the table with your trade unions and of course with the employers, but with the trade unions to work on a plan which would lead to a higher coverage ratio and the obligation to report to the European Commission, European Parliament, European social partners, how much progress you have already made in the past years with your action plan. So an action plan, involvement of social partners, aka the trade unions, and the obligation to regularly update this action plan and use, as has already also been said, other instruments, as for instance the public procurement, because this could also lead to, if you are clear that you only spend your governmental money on those companies who are working with a collective agreement, could also lead to a big push of the coverage rate of workers by collective agreements.
Thank you. Esther?
Thank you. So, if a member state currently has collective bargaining coverage of, let's say, 20%, and if at the end of a period of 4 years it has collective bargaining coverage of, let's say, 20%, obviously the action plan isn't working, and it would be available to the trade union to raise a concern with the Commission about the possible necessity of an infringement proceeding because the action plan wasn't effective. It's never open to an individual, but it would be open to a trade union, and it certainly would be open to the joint social partners to look for that. The obligation is also on the member state to have an enabling framework that promotes collective bargaining. And the directive itself points very clearly to the International Labour Organization's conventions and to the European Court of Human Rights and to the Council of Europe in that regard. So if a trade union, for example, looking at Jack O'Connor, who would have been very active at the Irish Congress of Trade Unions in raising concerns about Ireland's failure to secure respect for the fundamental labour conventions on the right to organise and collective bargaining, for example. If a member state was found to be in contravention with an ILO convention mentioned in the directive, well then obviously that member state is failing to respect the directive's obligation to promote collective bargaining in accordance with those provisions. Now, all of that will need a lot of training, and know that the ETUI is going to be available to give training, but also it'll need a lot of thinking from yourselves in relation to what support, what messages we're putting out as to what does it mean to have an action plan that promotes collective bargaining. It can't be that nothing changes. Then on the minimum wages, a little bit trickier. But the current crisis is going to throw it into very sharp relief. Because while it is absolutely essential that we keep minimum wages tracking wages in general, so that's why the collective bargaining provisions are important. The collective bargaining increases all wages, and by doing that you increase minimum wages if they're linked to all wages. But also now in this crisis, the adequacy check is going to be able, unfortunately and sadly, to rely on human rights questions that have already been answered of what is an adequate minimum wage. And to give you an example of that, the human rights standard says on minimum wages you should be able to afford your energy with 20 days of work. If you take the Czech Republic now, on minimum wage, you have to work 60 days to afford your energy. Human rights standards also identify how long you have to work to afford milk, how long you have to work to afford calories. And sadly, I fear by the end of this year, we could well be looking at those numbers. So I think that the directive could not be more timely and more useful. And that's why at the moment we're really pushing for an early transposition, that we don't need to wait the 2 years in the member states. So there are already human rights standards relating to what is an adequate minimum wage. Normally in Europe the minimum wages are higher than those, but I think over the coming months they're going to fall well below those minimum human rights standards. And again, that would be open then to a union to say that to write to the Commission and say we invite you to investigate whether our member state is properly respecting their obligations under this directive.
So I would now like to take 2 questions so we can get most of them in. Jack O'Connor and afterwards Angelo Pagliara.
Thank you, Chair, and I'd like to welcome all the speakers and the contributions, and I'd like in particular to salute, if I may, my comrade Esther Lynch, who soldiered with us in the Irish trade union movement in the worst years of the history of the movement, and learnt a lot. And she actually learnt one thing, only one thing from me, which was not to do what I did. So I compliment her on that. Just to say that obviously everything is very positive, and Commissioner Smith and all of the people who are associated with this great achievement are to be complimented. But I just want to point to a fly in the ointment, and that is the fly of progress without participation. I would suggest that this is a key issue for the trade union movement, because when it becomes endemic, it ultimately facilitates the disarmament of workers. Apart from what might be done at an institutional level, in terms of legal mechanisms, both at the Commission and at the level of the national governments, there is something that the trade unions can do, and they should be facilitated in doing it. And that is this, that in the mechanisms we have in Ireland, which were saved by the Irish Labour Party from the Troika and all the rest of them, and they got no credit for it. But in the mechanisms that we have, we managed to save them. Actually, we managed to improve them a little bit during the crisis years. when there is a negotiation, it's collective bargaining, all right, but the union members do not get a vote on the outcome. There are no ballots. And this is absolutely key. I don't know to what extent this applies generally across Europe, but this is the difference between ownership on the part of working people and something that is applied by an agreement between technocrats, from which people become alienated. And also, incidentally, if we find a way of insisting on balloting the people who are union members, we give them a say in the outcome, and we enhance the leverage of the negotiators. Now, of course, it doesn't make life easier for the negotiators on either side, but we didn't go into this for easy lives. And I would suggest that in our own strategizing, that we look at what we can do ourselves, and that we reflect that in terms of what we're seeking from the Commission, from this expert group that has been mentioned, and in what's being done at national level. In other words, that we insist that the mechanisms provide for the imperative of ballots of the relevant union members in the relevant sectors, and that be facilitated, and then that we do it. That's not going to solve the problem of alienation, but it's a start. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Now, Angelo Pagliara.
I will talk in Italian.
First of all, thank you very much for the work you've done for the European trade union system. And thank you, Cinzia, for the latest opinion. Thank you, Oliver, for always supporting the group. Esther, thank you for all of your work at ETUC. There are 2 points I wanted to raise, comments/questions. Cinzia said something that was very right, that minimum wage is not linked to productivity. And this was in a panel that is talking about cost of living. And also, Esther spoke of the current crises and the bills we have to pay. When we speak about the minimum salary, minimum wage, and collective bargaining, I think that the way that trade unions respond is vital. We cannot separate all of these issues. Let me elaborate. There is a need to implement the directive as quickly as possible. We can't wait 2 years. We need immediate responses straight away, both in the implementation of the directive as well as the implementation of a national collective bargaining plans. From what I've heard, Commissioner Schmidt wants to push forward the implementation of this directive. So my first question is, I know that at the EESC level, Oliver is working hard to make this happen. But my question is, both for the MEP as well as to Esther, how does the European Parliament intend to push things for the quick implementation of this directive, and what does the ETUC want to do as well so that this directive can be implemented? We all agree on the final goal. So how will we do this as quickly as possible? And my second question, also when speaking about the bills we have to pay, the crises and productivity, there is an objective problem. And the objective problem, which is linked to a minimum wage, the wage of workers, and inflation, cost of living, and rising energy prices. At the EESC, we've already expressed that we need a price cap on gas prices. Okay, we cannot look at all of these as separate and independent issues. The cost of energy is directly linked to minimum wages. So we have spoken very clearly in many opinions in this House that we need to have a price cap on gas. We know that at the European level, there is a divergence of opinions. Some European countries are in favor, some are against having a price cap. And out of this, we need to have a final response. So Esther, I'm turning to you. The ETUC needs to make that request stronger, and we really need to intervene on this matter because this is important for the purchasing power of our workers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to give Esther Lynch the possibility to respond also to Jack O'Connor, and then Agnes Jongerius on how you can push for a faster implementation. Looking at the time, I would hope we can discuss the gas question another time, and then so we can also have some other questions on this topic.
Jack, as always, is way too modest to learn an awful lot from you, Jack. So, and to thank you for all that learning too. I think that unions have such different ways of going about doing their business. It would be very difficult for the ETUC to hold an opinion on who should be balloted when, on what agreement by whom. But I do think, Jack, you make a very good point, which is about the danger of the technocrats doing all the deals and then everybody being very alienated from them. And that's one of the issues at the ETUC, if I can make a pitch now for the ETUC Congress in May 2023. This is going to be the main topic of discussion, which is about trade union renewal. How do we, and I don't mean that in a superficial way. We have to have a closed session, only trade unions there, and have a discussion about how we turn the curve down, or how we turn the downward curve up. Yesterday I talked a lot about it, about the Commission has set this target of 80% of workers covered by a collective agreement. That's very good and very useful. But we have this other problem that the trade union needs to solve, which is density. So if we don't have a strategy for density, the danger is workers get covered by a collective agreement. Good, we take the collective agreement out of competition. But without a parallel strategy developed and run by the trade unions, which is setting similar targets to push up density, we will be in trouble. So, but I think that is, and I think that was actually how you opened it up, Jack, was to say that it needs to be a trade union strategy run by, led by and run, and we say monitored by trade unions. If I can just say, I completely agree that we have that. That's why the ETUC has adopted a 6-point plan, is because we see it being like a Rubik cube. You can't fix one side of the Rubik cube and think the rest of it, oh, it's all fine now. You actually need all sides to be worked on all at the one time, and with the same understanding that what you do on one side affects the other side. And that's why we have a 6-point plan, is because it's the 6 parts that need to be worked on all at once, and with an absolute understanding that what you do in one place, you do in another place. So, thank you.
Yes, Agnes Jongerius.
I must say I have tried so many times, but was never able to solve this Rubik cube in my lifetime. So perhaps Esther can learn me some lessons on how to do this. But it's very good that you're mentioning the 6 points from the ETUC demands. Next week, the European Parliament will convene again in Strasbourg. And I'm very happy that the ETUC is coming with trade union colleagues to Strasbourg to push for this 6 points, one of which is the speedy implementation of the directive. We have been mentioning it too. And of course, I'm going to say I'm representing the Social Democrats in the European Parliament, but I'm happy to say that we were not the only group in the debates 2 weeks ago mentioned the fact that, of course, like in any directive, there is this transposition period, but that we call upon the member states to a speedy recovery. And I think this is, in a way, the task we have now. Put a formal signature under this directive, so the process can go ahead, but also keep pushing, because as has already been mentioned before in the introduction part, Nicolas Schmid responded positively on this call from the side of the European Parliament. But to be totally honest, in the same week we had this speech of the State of the Union of Ursula von der Leyen, and workers, minimum wage, and purchasing power wasn't mentioned one time. So it was a completely wall of silence from the president of the Commission. So we are not there yet. And therefore it's very useful that the ETUC is coming to Strasbourg. It's useful that we keep pushing for indeed these basic human rights, that we keep pushing for implementation of the 20 principles of the social pillar. And I must say I'm very motivated. I know that a lot of people are really doing their best to get this message across. But I wake up this morning to the message that in my country, the Netherlands, inflation last month has raised to 17%. And this is like, what is happening? So yes, our minimum wage will be increased with 10% as of the 1st of January next year, but with inflation figures nearly double, this is not doing the trick. So I think our main task in the coming period is keep pushing for urgent action from the member states towards those people who cannot make ends meet anymore.
I would now like to give the floor to Plamen Dimitrov. He is joining online.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I'd like to start by saying that when we first started talking about the two directives on minimum wage and collective bargaining 11 years ago, many people laughed, including within the unions, that this was inapplicable, while now we are on the verge of an approval of this directive, which is a huge victory, especially for us in Eastern Europe. We need to understand why this directive will give what it takes to the unions to continue their work. I'd like to stress two things without repeating myself. It's very important for me to find a way for the member states to be properly motivated to transpose the directive in the best possible way and as quickly as possible. This can be done by positive measures as well as by more radical measures. But I don't think we are using the European semester properly here. The recommendations to the member states are a proven mechanism which is not always successful, but it does give results. And when certain member states are not sufficiently willing to start applying the directive or are not keeping the deadlines for transposition, there is a mechanism, bonus malus mechanism, if not to punish, to exert pressure on those who are not fulfilling their obligations. And the second, what is very important, I'd like to say that we could find formulas which could incentivize the Commission to do the necessary research. Someone said previously that where the legislation is good, even where coverage is not that dense, we can achieve 100% coverage. And vice versa, where we do not have the respective legislative measures, we could not succeed in that. So law enforcement is one of the most important factors here. And we should see this clearly both in the analysis of the European Commission, and this is one of the tools that we could use at national level to put pressure on the governments in the process of implementing the directive. Otherwise, in Bulgaria, we already have our plan for changing 5 laws and for extending collective bargaining practices. At the national level, we have the respective mechanism, but it's underdeveloped on the sectoral level. So we know very well what we are doing, and we have the ambition to implement the directive in our legislation within a year and to start applying it in practice. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In light of the time, we will take no more questions now. We will have plenty of time for questions in the afternoon as well. But I would like to maybe give Cinzia Del Rio the floor to react to the comments.
Yes, I fully agree with what Plamen was saying concerning the European semester, because there are country-specific recommendations which can be used. We are also, as social partners in some countries, consulted or involved by the European Commission in the country missions, and therefore the respect of the provisions of the directive could be raised. Also, let's use all these opportunities. Of course, there is no a sanction-based system, as we have seen, but there is the possibility of using country-specific recommendations and the semester, and also in the capacity-building projects. We have already said to use the European funds as a result-based, with a result-based approach, because we have a lot of capacity building projects, and we can set some commitments, and we can use, since we are using European funds, these European funds should be used in order to have concrete results. These are some opportunities that we have to exploit more from our side.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your contributions for this discussion. Thank you, Oliver Röpke, Esther Lynch, Cinzia Del Rio, and Agnes Jongerius in the Netherlands. There will now be a break until 2:30. There is something to eat, and I've heard something about cocktails as well. So yeah, enjoy. And I'm looking forward to seeing you here in the room or online again at 2:30. Enjoy your break.